true if one rectangle intersects with another rectangle. So intersects with opening parentheses game object sub j dot rectangle, two closing parentheses, and double ampersand, opening parentheses, game object sub I dot status is equal to double equals, because we're checking a condition here, object status dot active, closing parentheses, and double ampersand, opening parentheses, game object sub j dot status, double equals, object status dot active, closing parentheses, and enter game object sub I dot collision. So we have a valid collision. We detected if one rectangle intersects another rectangle, and if they're both alive, we have a valid collision. So we just call the collision method. It doesn't matter which order you call it in. So game object sub I dot collision, opening parentheses, game object sub j, closing parentheses, and semicolon. Now I'm going to change I'm going to make it on multiple lines. That way I don't have to do all the horizontal scrolling. Alright, and if it's easier for you to look at, just add the opening closing curly brackets. Alright, so that's it for the check collision. Pretty simple. And now what we need to do is handle input. So in between spawn enemy and check collision, let's do public void handle, or public override handle input, delete the base. And let's get a local input system. Let's get a local reference to the input system. So input system input is equal to screen manager.input system. And if input.pause game, opening closing curly brackets, and just comment pause the game, because we didn't make the pause screen yet. Else we are not pausing the game. Here is another time that I had to do a for each loop to find the player, and then just go player.handle input. So we just save a lot of random looping to find the player. Alright, so that's it for the handle input. Now the main update method. Public override update. Leave base.update code above it. Alright. So first we need to copy all the added objects in the public static added objects. We need to copy all those elements into our game objects list. So all the elements waited to be added needs to be finally added in this loop. So add new game objects to the main list. So it's a for each gameplay object, and let's call it lowercase g, capital O, in added objects. So for every gameplay object named GO inside of our added objects list, remember we get that by calling the static add method. So inside the enemy class, or inside the player class, or inside the any class, if we want to add a bullet, if our enemy wants to throw a bullet, it can do it by just calling PlayScreen.add and new bullet. And that will be added to the added objects list. And now we need to do game objects.add, lowercase g, capital O, and now it's in our game objects list. Alright, so now we need to update the enemy spawn timer. So enemy spawn timer is equal to enemy spawn timer.subtract. This is the special method I talked about. that we can just use the game time dot elapsed game time. Now if enemy spawn timer dot total seconds is less than or equal to 0, let's spawn the enemy. Call the method spawn enemy. So our time is currently less than or equal to 0. We're ready to spawn an enemy. Now let's check collision. And let's clear the added objects because we already copied everything over. And let's clear the current game objects because we are now ready to copy all objects in game objects to current game objects for updating for each, just like above, gameplay object, lowercase g, capital O, in game objects. Let's copy them to the current game objects.add, lowercase g, capital O, and semicolon. Alright, so everything inside of our game objects is now copied in our current game object. Now if anything dies, we remove it from our game objects. We do not remove it from our current game objects. Alright, so now let's do a for loop, something different. Int I is equal to 0, I is less than current game objects.count I plus. So for loop, if current game object sub I dot status double equals object status dot dead, we do game objects dot remove current game object sub I closing parentheses and semicolon. So we can modify our game objects, but we cannot modify our current game objects. Now it's different with the for loop than a for each loop, but it might cause some issues with all the, you have to do some sort of manipulation with the I. Like whenever you remove it, you need to decrease I and things like that. So let's just keep it simple, separate it by using two different methods, or two different lists, and it's just easier that way. That way you can just delete the for loop and make a for each loop pretty easily. Else current game objects sub I dot update. Oop, we need to pass a game time, and now we're ready to go. Alright, after the for, let's check an if game over. So if game over is true, we need to exit the screen. We already know that method for that, so we do not need to comment that. Exit screen. And let's comment this out, but let's write it out. Screen manager dot add new game over screen. Capital G, O, and S. Two closing parentheses and semicolon. Alright, so that's commented out, so whenever we do this screen, we'll just uncomment it and check it out. Alright, so now we have a massive if that encapsulates all the stuff we just wrote. So above the comment, above the for each, and above the comment, let's make an if screen state is screen state dot active, opening curly bracket, and after the end curly bracket of the if game over, put another closing curly bracket. Now put an else below here, and all that's underneath the else is the base.update. And I can check what base.update's going to do. It's just going to do some stuff when it's transitioning on and off and all that junk. Alright, so if it's active, we do all this stuff here. Otherwise, we just do base.update. Alright, so that's it for the update. Spawn enemy, handle input, collision detection. Now we just have the drawing. Where's the end region? Here. Region, draw, methods. And end region before the static. Alright. So before we have the main draw method, but before that, let's have a public void draw strings. And this will be to draw our HUD, our information, like a new enemy in 10 seconds. How many hits we have left and how many enemies were killed. So it's just a counter for that. Okay, so draw strings. Let's get a reference to viewport view is equal to screen manager.viewport. That just holds our screen resolution. Now we can either grab another reference to our screen or our sprite batch from a screen manager, but we can just pass it to the draw strings if we want to. So to draw strings, let's make a parameter sprite batch, and then all we have to do is reference that by sprite batch.drawString. What we're going to do is we need to pass it the font object, which is just font, and the text is new quote new enemy in colon space end quote plus enemy spawn timer dot seconds dot toString. No semicolon, but a comma. New vector 2 somewhere on the top left or bottom right. So I'm going to do 2, 0 for the top left, comma, color.white, closing parentheses and semicolon. Now, yet another method that I had to do a for loop to get the player. But since we already have a player, let's create a string info is equal to quote hits left colon space end quote plus player dot get hits no semicolon plus quote 3 spaces kills colon space end quote plus player dot get kills opening closing parentheses and semicolon sprite batch dot draw string font is the object name, info is the string, new vector 2. We want this in the bottom right. So we just grab our viewport, so our view.width, our resolution, 1280. Currently, you can change it. Minus our font.measure string. We want to measure the info string dot x. So the width of our string, we get that from our measure string method from our sprite font object, comma, view.height minus font.line spacing, closing parentheses, comma, color.white, closing parentheses and semicolon.